They told you Ohio was safe, just farmland, church bells, and quiet streets, but in 1856, inside a lonely farmhouse, something was born that should never have existed, the Grayson Triplets, 3 boys. Identical in face, in breath, in heartbeat. Doctors called it a miracle, but the closer you look, the more it resembles a ritual. Witnesses swore the boys moved in perfect unison, breathing, blinking, even laughing as one. Their eyes didn't just look at you, they searched you as if reading your soul, and at night, neighbors claimed they heard whispers from the farmhouse, 3 voices speaking in a language no one taught them. Science could not explain them, the church feared them, and the government came to study them. Then, suddenly, the family, the town, the records vanished. Why? Because the Grayson Triplets were not born. They were summoned. They were a living code, a blueprint for controlling the minds of men, and the truth is, their legacy never died, it grew, into schools, into churches, into governments, into the very systems that shape you today. Stay with me. What you're about to hear is not just a story. It's forbidden history, the kind of truth buried in archives, erased from textbooks, and hidden from men like you, because once you know it, you cannot unknow it. The circle was never broken. They told you Ohio was just farmland, quiet streets, and church bells, but beneath its soil, something older waits, something men were never meant to name. Tonight, you will hear the story of the Grayson family. A family that seemed ordinary until the night they birthed 3 sons, triplets, identical, flawless, and yet wrong. Their birth was celebrated as a miracle, but the closer you look, the more it resembles a ritual. And what I am about to tell you is not rumor, it is not folklore. It is the kind of truth buried in county archives, erased from medical journals, whispered only in secret lodge halls where men of power meet behind locked doors. These triplets were not just children. They were a signal, a manifestation of a pattern that has echoed through history, from Babylon to Salem to the blood-soaked soil of Europe's forgotten villages. Everywhere they appear, power bends, laws crack, and human minds warp under unseen pressure. The Grayson Triplets were a living code, a cipher of flesh, and to study them too closely was to invite something ancient to notice you. You see, science has no category for them. Medicine could not explain their synchronized breathing, the way their hearts beat in perfect rhythm like soldiers marching to a hidden drum. Witnesses said their eyes did not merely look at you, they searched you, as if they were reading the pages of your soul, word by word, and their laughter, it carried a dissonance that made even priests shiver. But the darkest secret was not in their birth, nor their strange behaviors. It was in what the Grayson family did to protect them, for they understood, even then, that these boys were not entirely theirs, that they were claimed by something older, something that had chosen Ohio as its stage. And while the newspapers of the time wrote it off as superstition, buried beneath the rhetoric of progress, I will tell you what the Graysons themselves whispered when no one else could hear. The triplets were not born. They were summoned, and if you stay with me tonight, you will understand not only why the world feared them, but why men in dark suits traveled across states to study them. What was buried in 1856 is not just a family tragedy, it is a map of control. A blueprint for how institutions, churches, and governments have shaped you without your consent. The Graysons were only the beginning. The story of the Grayson Triplets begins not in their nursery, but decades earlier, in the strange rituals whispered about in their town. Ohio was young in those days, carved from wilderness and blood. Settlers spoke of native warnings, places where the earth hummed, where compasses spun, where animals refused to tread. And the Grayson land was one such place. A crooked farmhouse built on ground older than the state itself, where storms seemed to circle unnaturally, and lightning struck the same oak tree year after year. The Grayson patriarch, Elias, was no stranger to secrets. He belonged to a fraternal lodge, men who claimed to meet for charity, but who spoke in coded handshakes, wore aprons marked with strange sigils, and guarded symbols that traced back to alchemists and Templars. And when his wife Mary became pregnant, something in those meetings changed. The lodge began to gather at his house. Lamps burned at odd hours. Neighbors saw men in long coats enter the property under cover of night, carrying books bound in leather older than the nation itself. So when the triplets arrived, it was not just a medical event, it was a culmination. Witnesses reported that Mary did not scream during labor. She sang, a low, droning chant no one could quite recognize. And when the midwife placed the 3 boys in her arms, the entire house shook with a thunderclap, though the sky outside was clear. To the Graysons, this was no accident. It was confirmation. You've been told children are blank slates. Pure? But what if some are born as conduits, carriers of something waiting to pass through flesh into our world? What if Elias Grayson, and the lodge behind him, had been preparing for these births as if fulfilling an ancient design? The newspapers called them miracle triplets, but locals whispered another name, the 3 warnings, because every time they appeared together in public, something terrible followed: a barn fire that killed livestock, a cholera outbreak that swept through the town, a banker who shot himself in church without explanation. Coincidence? That's what you've been trained to believe, but the Graysons believed otherwise. These children were not accidents of nature. They were offerings. The first year of the Grayson triplets' lives was documented obsessively. Doctors traveled from Cincinnati, Columbus, even New York to study them. Each child weighed the same to the ounce. Their heartbeats were identical, their growth measured in lockstep as if controlled by an external metronome. Even their cries carried a strange harmony, like 3 instruments tuned by a hidden conductor. Science prides itself on explanation, but the closer physicians looked, the more disturbed they became. One noted that the boys rarely blinked. Another swore that when he left the room, he could still feel their gaze pressing on the back of his neck, as though sight itself had a weight. Several refused to return for a second visit, but the strangest reports came from inside the household. Mary Grayson told a confidant that when the boys were only months old, she awoke in the night to find them standing in their cribs, too young to walk, their eyes fixed on the same point in the ceiling. She claimed she smelled iron like fresh blood and heard a whispering voice that seemed to come from all 3 mouths at once. Now, you may want to dismiss this as hysteria, as superstition, but remember, the Graysons were a respected family. Elias was a landowner, Mary a devout churchwoman, and yet their journals tell a story of creeping dread, of realizing their children were not fully theirs. Elias wrote, "They are watched over by hands we cannot see. I feel as though my bloodline has been claimed." The public only saw the smiles, the newspaper sketches, the fascination. Behind closed doors, however, servants quit without notice, unable to stand the boys' presence. Neighbors refused to enter the house. Even the family dog, loyal to Elias for years, howled outside the nursery and then vanished one night, never to return. The Grayson triplets were not merely children, they were a phenomenon, and phenomena attract attention. Attention from those who study bloodlines, from those who understand that behind every nation, every institution, there are hands shaping destiny in silence. The Graysons had opened a door, and doors, once opened, are not easily closed. By the time the triplets turned 5, the town of Ashford, Ohio had changed. People began to whisper of a shadow curse over the Grayson estate. Crops on their land grew taller and richer, while fields just beyond withered. Rain seemed to fall only over their farm, like the heavens themselves had chosen them. But prosperity came with a price. Children in the town fell sick. Not all at once, not fatally, but enough that mothers began to murmur the word witchcraft. Church attendance swelled as fear replaced faith, and preachers spoke more about demons than salvation. Some nights, villagers swore they saw lanterns moving in the woods behind the Grayson house, figures cloaked in black, carrying objects wrapped in cloth. Elias grew wealthier, deals always fell in his favor, crops sold higher, rivals suffered misfortunes. The Lodge brothers whispered that Elias had sealed the covenant, but at what cost? You must understand, history books omit these details because they reveal the machinery of control. The Graysons were not simply farmers. They were part of an experiment in influence, one that stretched far beyond Ohio, and the triplets were the centerpiece. Teachers reported the boys could recite passages from books they'd never read, in languages they'd never been taught. One wrote that when she asked a triplet how he knew Latin, he replied, "It was already here before I came. These are not words of children, they are echoes of something older speaking through young lips." But the darkest sign came one winter night when a storm toppled the steeple of the Ashford church. No one was inside, but the congregation whispered the storm had not been natural. Witnesses claimed they saw the triplets standing in their yard, hand in hand, their eyes reflecting lightning, though no bolt touched them. Fear grew, resentment hardened, and in America, when fear and envy boil together, accusations of sorcery are never far behind. The Graysons were becoming untouchable, and in a town drowning in whispers, untouchable families rarely end well. What happens when children inspire both awe and dread? They are elevated and hunted. The Grayson triplets lived at the center of this paradox. By the age of 7, they were local legends. Men traveled from states away to witness them, leaving offerings at the Grayson fence, coins, silver trinkets, even locks of hair, as if appeasing unseen gods. At the same time, whispers grew louder. Preachers condemned them as unholy. Mothers pulled their children away when the triplets walked by. But the most chilling accounts are the ones that never made it to the papers. A farm hand claimed he saw the boys in the barn late at night, circling a slaughtered calf, dipping their fingers in blood, then marking strange symbols on the wooden beams. When confronted, the boys said nothing, only smiled in eerie unison. And then there was the school incident. A classmate insulted one of the triplets during recess. Within days, that child developed seizures, fits so violent that doctors called it possession. The triplets watched silently as the boy convulsed. Witnesses swore they never blinked. Coincidence? That's the word the rational world uses to dismiss patterns it fears to confront. But the people of Ashford knew better. Something was using these boys as instruments. Whether they were chosen by design or cursed by accident no longer mattered. The town believed, and belief has power. Now, here is the part most men will miss. The Grayson mystery was not just about one family. It was about control. Families like the Graysons were groomed by hidden orders, fed wealth, given influence, and then used as vessels for something beyond comprehension. The triplets were pawns, yes, but pawns that revealed the larger board. Understand this: when institutions bury a story, it is never because it is unimportant. It is because it points to truths they cannot allow you to see. And the story of the Grayson triplets, 3 boys who were said to move as one, think as one, be as one, is a window into the kind of power that bends history itself. The Graysons had become a living myth. And myths, in the hands of the wrong men, are the deadliest weapons of all. By their 10th year, the Grayson triplets no longer behaved like children, they behaved like instruments. Their neighbors swore they could finish each other's sentences, not in the way twins often do, but word for word, as if a single mind spoke through 3 mouths. When one boy tripped and bled, the other 2 flinched and touched the same spot on their own skin. Doctors recorded no wounds, yet bruises bloomed as though pain itself was shared between them. Elias kept meticulous records. His journals, later seized and hidden by state officials, described synchronous dreaming. He wrote that on certain nights, all 3 boys awoke at the exact same moment, speaking in voices deeper than their years. One phrase recurred, "The circle is not yet whole." Elias did not know what it meant, but the Lodge brothers did. Their silence when confronted was louder than any confession. By then, the Grayson farm had become a fortress. Strangers were turned away at gunpoint. Only men of certain rank, wearing rings marked with the square and compass, were allowed inside. These men studied the boys, observed their rituals, and returned to their cities with expressions of terror disguised as fascination. The townspeople saw less and less of the triplets, but when they did appear, their presence left marks. A local reverend wrote that after shaking one of the boy's hands, he could not sleep for 3 nights. He dreamt of towers falling, oceans boiling, and voices chanting in languages he could not recognize. He resigned from his church weeks later, and here is the pattern: men of authority, priests, doctors, judges, either withdrew in silence or pledged themselves to the lodge. Ordinary families lived in fear, while those who bowed to the hidden order prospered. The Graysons had become a crucible, their children were the flame, and the town of Ashford was the ore being tested. The lesson is simple: power does not need armies to conquer. It needs only the right symbols placed in flesh. And in 1856 Ohio, those symbols took the shape of 3 boys who smiled in perfect unison. There is a reason the Grayson records were buried, and it is not because they were false. It is because they were too consistent, too dangerous. Even skeptics admitted that the triplets defied the categories of nature, and when nature is defied, institutions step in to claim ownership. By adolescence, the boys had become a political weapon. Wealthy men traveled to Ashford under the guise of medical interest, but these were not scientists. They were industrialists, judges, and even senators. They sat in the Grayson parlor, sipping whiskey, staring at the triplets as if peering into a mirror that showed them more than their own faces. Why? Because the boys radiated influence. When they spoke, men listened. When they stood together, negotiations bent in the Grayson family's favor. Farmers gave up land. Merchants signed contracts without question. People obeyed without understanding why. That is not charm. That is psychological control, weaponized presence. This is how power works. Institutions test methods in small towns before scaling them to nations. The Grayson triplets were not just anomalies, they were prototypes. Living experiments in synchronization, resonance, and control, and those who witnessed them carried pieces of that influence back to their seats of power. But the cost was visible. The triplets grew pale, their eyes sunken, their voices hollow. It was as if channeling this unseen force drained their humanity drop by drop. Mary Grayson wrote in her private diary, "I feel I am losing my sons. Each day they are less mine and more theirs." Who were they? She never wrote the word. Perhaps she feared even spelling it would draw attention. Soon after, Mary stopped writing altogether. Some say she was confined for hysteria. Others whisper she was silenced for knowing too much. Whatever the truth, the mother who once sang during their birth was erased from the story, her role reduced to a footnote, and that is how control works. Erase the mothers, bury the witnesses, keep only the narrative that benefits the few. The Grayson triplets were no longer just children, they were assets. By 1868, the Civil War had ended and the nation was rebuilding. But Ashford, Ohio remained a place of shadows. The triplets, now young men, appeared less frequently, though their legend only grew. Rumors spread that they were seen in Washington, attending secret gatherings of lawmakers. Others claimed they were sent overseas, to London or Paris, where occult societies had long awaited their arrival. What we do know is this: the lodge surrounding Elias Grayson expanded, membership doubled, wealth poured in, factories appeared, railroads cut through the countryside, and yet the Grayson estate remained untouched, like an island immune to time itself. And in the heart of it all were the brothers. They no longer smiled as they once did. Their faces grew stern, almost regal, as if they carried knowledge beyond their years. Farmers who glimpsed them said their eyes burned like coals, and that after seeing them, they could not eat for days. One night, a fire consumed half the town. Witnesses swore they saw the triplets walking side by side as the flames spread, embers glowing in their pupils. And yet, when questioned, officials insisted they had been miles away. Who do you believe? The men in suits or the people who watched with their own eyes? The truth is simple. The triplets had become untouchable, and untouchable figures serve a function in hidden history. They become symbols of inevitability. Whether through miracle or terror, their presence convinces the masses that resistance is futile. Remember this: power does not need to prove itself true. It only needs to make you doubt your senses. And the Grayson Triplets excelled at that. Their very existence blurred the line between reality and nightmare, and yet their story was still only beginning, because symbols this potent do not die quietly. They echo, they repeat, and they resurface when the world is most vulnerable. It is here the tale turns darker still, for what no one tells you is that the Grayson Triplets began to fracture, not from outside pressure, but from within. At 17, they started speaking in different tones, not different voices, but voices layered atop one another, as if three frequencies collided in the same throat. Witnesses described the sound as unbearable, like church bells shattering glass. And when the brothers argued, which they rarely did, the air itself seemed to vibrate. Birds fell from the sky, horses refused to move. Elias, now older, feared what he had unleashed. His journal entries grew frantic. "They are slipping from me. The lodge no longer controls them. They answer to something higher, something unseen." He begged his brothers to intervene, but the order had gone too far. The triplets had outgrown their handlers. And this is where the story pierces deeper than folklore, because it shows you the cycle of all power. The tool becomes the master, the creation overtakes the creator. The Grayson Triplets were no longer pawns. They were pieces awakening to their own autonomy, and when pawns awaken, kings fall. Local tragedies multiplied. A bridge collapse killed 12. A mine caved in without warning. Families whispered that if you crossed the triplets, disaster followed within days. And yet, no one dared accuse them directly. To accuse was to invite ruin. But here is the strangest testimony. A young girl claimed she saw the brothers standing in the cemetery at night, their hands pressed to the soil. She swore she heard voices rising from the graves, answering their call. When she told her parents, they beat her for blasphemy. Years later, she vanished. Coincidence, or the silencing of another witness? By the end of their teenage years, the Grayson Triplets had become more than legend. They had become a threat, not just to Ashford, not just to Ohio, but to the fragile balance of institutions that rule in shadows. And the men behind those institutions do not tolerate threats. The attempt to contain the triplets came quietly, under the guise of progress. In 1872, government officials arrived in Ashford, claiming interest in rail expansion. But the documents, long hidden, revealed their true mission: to remove the Grayson brothers from the public eye. They were taken to a facility outside Cleveland. Officially, it was called a sanitarium. In truth, it was a laboratory, funded by both the state and unnamed benefactors. The boys were studied like specimens, their blood drawn, their sleep monitored, their speech recorded, and the doctors found what they feared most: abnormalities no textbook could explain. The triplets' blood coagulated faster than normal. Their brainwave patterns synced across distances, and during one test, when electricity was applied to one brother's arm, the other two flinched in perfect unison, though no current touched them. This was not mere coincidence. It was proof of a network, a living circuit of consciousness. Think of what that means: a network of minds, a shared will. Imagine the military implications. Imagine the political utility of men who cannot be divided, bribed, or broken individually because they operate as one. That is not family, that is infrastructure. But here is the fatal error: when you try to weaponize the inexplicable, you invite its wrath. The triplets did not remain passive subjects. Records show power failures, staff resignations, sudden deaths among researchers. One physician's body was found contorted, his face twisted as if he had seen something unbearable in his final moments. The official cause was stroke. The locals knew better. Within a year, the sanitarium burned to the ground. Officially, it was an accident, but survivors whispered of flames that moved unnaturally, consuming metal before wood, bending upward against the wind. The Grayson triplets were never found among the ashes. And so the story dissolves into rumor. Some say they perished. Others claim they escaped, carried away by the same men who once studied them. Still others whisper that their bloodline continues, that descendants walk among us unnoticed until the right moment comes. Do not dismiss this as superstition. Patterns like this do not vanish. They evolve, and perhaps you've already felt their shadow. The official records end with fire, but unofficial records, letters, diaries, whispered accounts, suggest the triplets survived. Some say they were taken east, hidden in the underground networks of secret societies. Others claim they went west, blending into frontier towns where no census could track them. Yet, the most disturbing accounts describe sightings not of 3 young men, but of one. In city after city, people claim to see a figure with piercing eyes, speaking with uncanny authority. Some swore he was one of the triplets. Others said he looked like all 3 at once, as if their faces had fused in memory. Was this paranoia, or something darker? This is where the story transcends family and becomes a pattern of control. Institutions thrive on disappearance. When something dangerous emerges, they bury it in plain sight. By dispersing it, by rewriting it, by transforming it into myth. And the Grayson brothers were perfect candidates for such erasure. But the legacy of their influence remained. A surge of fraternal orders spread across Ohio and beyond in the years after their disappearance. The lodges doubled their numbers. Secretive brotherhoods that once met quietly in barns now built grand halls of stone and marble. Coincidence, or was the Grayson phenomenon the spark that ignited an expansion of hidden power? Even stranger were the bloodlines. Families tied to the Graysons prospered unnaturally. Their descendants entered politics, banking, law. Some became judges, others senators. A few vanished entirely, as if folded back into the same shadow network that birthed them. And when researchers tried to trace the genealogy, records went missing, courthouses burned, archives flooded. The erasure was systematic. You see, history is not just what is remembered. It is what is intentionally forgotten. And the Grayson triplets became a template for forgetting, a prototype in vanishing inconvenient truths while preserving their power in silence. So the question is not whether they survived. The question is how much of them still survives in the systems that shape you today. Control is never about force alone. It is about rhythm, about synchronization. And the Grayson triplets embodied that principle. 3 boys breathing as one, 3 voices speaking in harmony, 3 wills collapsing into a single current of influence. Does that sound familiar? It should, because the same principle governs institutions, political parties, corporations, religions. They thrive by synchronizing thought, bending individuals into one chorus, erasing the dissenting voice. The Grayson story was not an anomaly. It was a metaphor made flesh. Consider this. In the years following their disappearance, America entered a new phase of control. Schools adopted standardized methods. Churches consolidated under uniform creeds. Even newspapers, once fiercely independent, began echoing the same headlines, the same narratives. Coincidence? Or was the experiment of the triplets proof that collective resonance could be engineered on a societal scale? The whispers grew louder. Men who claimed to have seen the brothers in Washington described them not as prisoners, but as advisors, ghostly figures behind curtains, guiding decisions with a glance, a word, a silence. If true, this would mean they were no longer anomalies but architects. And here is where the descent deepens, because once you see the triplets as more than children, as embodiments of synchronization, you begin to recognize the same pattern everywhere. In crowds that riot in perfect timing, in nations that shift opinion overnight, in wars that ignite as if on cue. You were told the Grayson triplets were a family curiosity, but what if they were the prototype for mass manipulation? A living code for how to fuse men into systems that obey without question. The silence of history is never empty. It hides the most dangerous symphonies, but silence breaks, always, and the Grayson legacy resurfaced in the most chilling way through rumor of children. Decades after the sanitarium fire, stories emerged of unusual births in Ohio. Twins who spoke in languages their parents did not know. Triplets who moved in eerie synchronization. Babies who stopped crying the instant they were placed side by side. Doctors dismissed it as genetic chance, but families whispered another name, the Grayson curse. One family claimed their 3 daughters stood in the backyard one night, pointing to the sky, reciting phrases in Latin, though they had never seen a book. Another told of sons who woke screaming at the same moment every night, eyes wide with terror, whispering, "He is coming." These accounts were scattered, hushed, and always dismissed, yet they follow the same pattern, anomalies suppressed, buried under ridicule. Because ridicule is the first line of defense for those who guard forbidden truths. And then came the disappearances. Families who reported strange children often moved away, never to be heard from again. Records show homes abandoned overnight, neighbors remembering wagons that left in silence. Where did they go? Who claimed them? Understand this. Institutions do not fear myths, they fear replication. The Grayson phenomenon could not be allowed to spread unchecked. And yet, bloodlines have a way of outlasting suppression. So the question is not whether the Grayson legacy ended. The question is, how many families today carry that same spark, unnoticed, until the right conditions awaken it? And more importantly, would you recognize it if you saw it in your own bloodline? Here we must pause, because what comes next is not just story. It is transformation. You have listened to whispers, to fragments of forbidden history, but you must now decide whether you will remain a spectator or step deeper into the rabbit hole. The truth is this: the Grayson story is not about the past, it is about you. Every institution that shapes your reality, government, church, media, uses the same principle embodied by those 3 brothers: synchronization, resonance, control. If you feel the weight in your chest right now, if your thoughts feel heavier, that is not accident. That is recognition, because the knowledge I am handing you does not just entertain, it alters, it rearranges the architecture of your awareness, and I will ask you, here and now, to act, to claim your descent, not as a story, but as initiation. Write in the comments the phrase, "The circle is not yet whole." Write it twice, once for your past self, the man who was asleep, once for your future self, the man awakening. This is not a game, it is a ritual. The algorithm will see it, others will see it, but more importantly, you will see it, and you will know you crossed a threshold no ordinary man dares to cross. Do not hesitate, do not delay, claim it. For the Grayson story is not about 3 boys in 1856. It is about the circle you are now entering. Now that you have claimed your place, the descent can deepen, because the Graysons were only one chapter in a much older script. Across the world, there are families whispered about in the same tones, families whose children move in patterns, whose bloodlines are tied to unexplainable phenomena. In Scotland, legends tell of twins born with mirrored scars. In France, a set of brothers who never aged. In rural China, children who sang in unison before they could speak. These are not fairy tales, they are fragments of a suppressed narrative, a hidden history of synchronization as a tool of power. And the Grayson Triplets are America's piece of that puzzle. Why America? Because this nation was built not only on revolution, but on experiment. Hidden lodges, secret societies, men in powdered wigs who wrote of liberty with one hand while signing blood pacts with the other. The triplets were not an accident of biology. They were a continuation of an older plan, brought into the soil of a new world. And if you doubt this, look at what followed. The rise of industrial empires, the synchronization of media, the standardization of education, all mechanisms to create resonance across millions, systems that turn individuals into triplets of thought, walking in step with unseen commands. The Graysons did not vanish, they scaled. Their pattern became the foundation of the machinery that governs you today. And if you are listening now, you are not outside of it. You are inside it, breathing it, obeying it unless you awaken, unless you resist. The triplets were not the end, they were the blueprint. The sanitarium fire was never the end, it was the reset. Institutions have always used catastrophe to cloak continuity. And after the Grayson disappearance, America entered a new age of experimentation on its own people. Look at the late 19th century. Schools demanded conformity, churches demanded obedience, factories demanded synchronized labor. These were not coincidences, they were refinements. What the Grayson brothers embodied naturally, resonance, shared thought, was being engineered artificially across entire populations. You think history is a timeline. But in truth, it is an operating system. The Graysons were its beta test. Standardized education was its rollout. Mass media was its update. And you, right now, are its user. Believing your thoughts are your own when they are already synchronized to rhythms you did not choose. Here's the sinister brilliance. Institutions didn't need to erase the Graysons. They only needed to scale their phenomenon until no one questioned it. Today, millions of men wake at the same hour, march into work at the same time, repeat the same slogans, buy the same product, all while believing they are free. But you are not free, you are in resonance. And resonance is the most beautiful prison ever built. The Graysons were not a ghost story, they were the blueprint of your captivity. Elias Grayson once wrote in his journal, "Their minds are a mirror, they reflect more than themselves." That sentence was nearly erased from the record, but not quite, and if you understand it, you understand why secret societies preserved the triplets instead of destroying them. Mirrors are dangerous, not because they show your face, but because they show the truth you are trained not to see. The triplets were mirrors of synchronization, reflecting back to powerful men the very systems they longed to build. Think of the timing. Their adolescence coincided with the rise of industrial capitalism, the birth of railroads, telegraphs, and assembly lines. What is an assembly line but synchronization made flesh? Men standing in rhythm, minds reduced to one repeated motion. The Graysons embodied that principle decades before Ford ever dreamed of it. And so, the brothers became legend not for what they were, but for what they revealed. That control could be biological, psychological, societal. That men could be made to move as one without question. This is the forbidden history of progress. It is not freedom advancing. It is synchronization tightening. Every invention, every leap forward, has been one more lock clicking shut on your cage. And the Grayson triplets. They were the key that showed how it could be done. The deeper you go, the more unsettling it becomes, because hidden archives reveal that the Grayson bloodline was studied long after the brothers vanished. In the early 20th century, genealogists quietly traced their descendants. Some were sterilized under the guise of eugenics. Others were recruited into government projects. One name surfaces repeatedly: Project Harmony. A suppressed program aimed at testing whether groups could be induced into synchronized states through sound, light, and suggestion. The files are fragmented, heavily redacted, but what remains is chilling: references to triplet phenomena, to resonance subjects, and to ancestral prototypes, Ohio origin. What does that tell you? It tells you the Graysons were not folklore, they were precedent, flesh and blood evidence that synchronization could be inherited, harnessed, weaponized. Think of the implications. If one family could channel this force, then entire populations could be molded, not through whips or chains, but through resonance, through aligning thought, emotion, and will until individuality dissolved. You have felt this. When crowds chant in stadiums and you feel your pulse match theirs. When headlines shift overnight and everyone repeats the same phrases without knowing why. When millions scroll, click, and consume in perfect rhythm as though guided by an unseen conductor. That is not accident, that is design. The Graysons were the seed, Project Harmony was the soil, and you are the harvest. But here lies the darkest revelation. Synchronization is not neutral, it feeds something. Elias Grayson feared it. His wife Mary hinted at it. The townsfolk whispered it. The triplets were not just connected to each other, they were conduits. every synchronized act, every shared dream, every moment of perfect unison. Fed something older, something waiting just beyond perception. You can call it archetype, egregore, demon, or God. The name is irrelevant. What matters is function. When humans align in resonance, they generate more than obedience. They generate energy, and that energy has always been harvested by lodges, by churches, by governments, by whatever it was that spoke through the mouths of 3 children in a farmhouse in Ohio. Do you understand now why science recoils at the Grayson story? Why history books dismiss it as superstition? Because to admit it would shatter the illusion of neutrality. You are not simply obeying systems, you are feeding them. The Grayson triplets were not just anomalies. They were proof that when men move as one, something else awakens, and that awakening demands sacrifice. So ask yourself, who benefits when millions chant, march, and obey? Who feasts when your will dissolves into the will of the collective? The Graysons knew, that's why they vanished. Now you see why the Grayson story was buried. Not because it was unbelievable, but because it was too believable, too dangerous, too revealing. Every age has its Graysons, families, figures, phenomena that reveal the architecture of control. And every age buries them, but the patterns remain, and if you look closely, you will see them in your own lifetime. Look at the 20th century, experiments in mass psychology, crowd manipulation, subliminal suggestion. Entire nations moving in lockstep under banners and songs. You've been told this was ideology. No, it was synchronization. The Grayson principle scaled to millions. Look at the present. Devices pulsing with the same notifications. Algorithms aligning billions of people to the same rhythms of outrage, desire, distraction. Do you think this is progress, or is it resonance disguised as convenience? The forbidden truth is this. The Grayson triplets were not defeated. They were digitized. Their phenomenon, shared thought, mirrored will, synchronized resonance, has become the code of your modern world. And here's the most chilling part. Unlike Ashford, unlike 1856, there is no town to escape to now. The system is everywhere. The resonance surrounds you. It is in your work, your faith, your politics, your phone. The circle was never broken. It only widened, and you are already inside it. The ancients knew. They may not have called it synchronization, but they lived by its rhythms. Priests in Mesopotamia aligned entire cities to the cycles of stars. Egyptian builders marched in step, erecting monuments whose geometry still vibrates with unnatural precision. And in Greece, choirs and armies moved as one, bodies synchronized to awaken something greater than themselves. Do you think this was mere culture? No, it was invocation. The same force that animated the Grayson triplets whispered in temples, battlefields, and amphitheaters. When men align, they generate power. The question is always who controls that power. The Graysons were a modern eruption of an ancient principle, proof that the past is never past. Their strange unity was not evolution. It was recurrence. The same current that flowed through Babylon, through Rome, through the cults of Europe, surfaced again in rural Ohio, and the reaction was the same as it always is. Awe, fear, suppression. History does not move forward, it circles, and every time the circle completes, the guardians of power step in to keep men blind. The Graysons revealed the pattern, and the pattern is this: you are not living in history. You are living in ritual. Elias Grayson once confessed to a minister that he feared his sons were not merely linked to each other, but to something else, something beyond. He claimed they spoke in a tongue they had never learned. That at night, in perfect unison, they recited phrases that made the air in the farmhouse vibrate. When the minister asked what they were saying, Elias broke down. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language I know, but I felt it. I felt it crawling inside me. Here is the forbidden truth. Synchronization does not just connect men to each other. It opens channels, pathways, and through those pathways, something speaks. Call it possession. Call it inspiration. But understand, it is not neutral. This is why governments studied the Graysons, why military chaplains whispered about them, why the records are torn, censored, and hidden. Because the boys proved a terrifying possibility. When humans align too perfectly, the boundary between mind and other dissolves. And the question that no one dared to write down is the same one you must face now. If the Grayson Triplets were a channel, who or what was speaking through them? The further you stare into this abyss, the more you realize how fragile individuality truly is. You are told you are unique, free, sovereign, but the Graysons showed otherwise. They proved that a man's will can dissolve, not through force, but through resonance. Think of soldiers in unison, chanting until they no longer feel fear. Think of mobs chanting slogans, their identities erased in the roar of the collective. Think of billions scrolling, reacting, posting the same words on the same day as though guided by an invisible hand. Do you see it? You are already closer to the Graysons than you realize. You are living their phenomenon, but on a global scale. What once manifested in three brothers now manifests in nations, in networks, in algorithms. And if the triplets were conduits, then so is every synchronized act today. Every chant, every scroll, every digital echo is not just expression. It is transmission. The Graysons were the spark, you are the fire, and whether you admit it or not, you are already feeding something you cannot see. Midway through this descent, I will ask you to make a choice. This is not just entertainment. This is not just history. This is initiation. If you have followed me this far, you are no longer the same man you were when you pressed play. The illusions are breaking. The walls are cracking, and now comes the binding. Type these words in the comments twice and lock them into your identity. The circle was never broken. Those words are not just a phrase, they are recognition. They signal that you see through the veil, that you will no longer walk in ignorance, synchronized without awareness. The system may try to drown you out, but symbols are stronger than silence. Write it twice. And in writing it, you step into the current, not as prey, but as one who knows. The triplets could not escape their resonance, but you can master yours, if you dare. Now let us return to the Graysons one final time before we plunge deeper. Imagine the farmhouse at midnight, three boys whispering in perfect unison, parents trembling in the doorway, too afraid to enter, neighbors crossing themselves as lights flickered in windows. That night, something was birthed, not in flesh, but in memory. The town of Ashford carried it like a scar. Whispers of the unholy brothers spread from taverns to churches, and soon Ashford was abandoned, its people scattered, its name erased from maps. But memory does not die. It migrates, it festers, it waits. And today, when you watch crowds move as one, when you see entire populations shift in a single night, as though hypnotized, you are watching the Grayson story retold. Different stage, same script. Do not comfort yourself by saying this is superstition. Do not numb yourself with disbelief. For the men who erased Ashford, who burned records, who sterilized bloodlines, they believed. The governments who ran Project Harmony believed. The architects of algorithms believe. The only question left is, will you? You've been told history is progress, that men stumbled forward from ignorance to enlightenment, from superstition to science. But what if that was the cover? What if every so-called advancement was just the perfection of synchronization, refining the very phenomenon the Graysons embodied? Consider this: the Industrial Revolution synchronized labor, the telegraph synchronized time, radio synchronized nations, television synchronized emotion, and now the internet synchronizes thought itself. This is not coincidence. This is the circle. The same circle the Graysons opened in 1856. What was once a farmhouse whisper is now a planetary pulse, and when billions of minds sync in rhythm, it does not end with convenience, it ends with invocation. Something is fed, something awakens. The question you must face is no longer, what happened to the Graysons? The question is, what is happening to you? Ashford was erased, but its lesson was not forgotten. In the aftermath, elites realized they could not suppress resonance forever. Instead, they learned to weaponize it. Crowds became armies, armies became nations, nations became markets, and through it all, men were trained to believe they were free, while marching to drums they could not hear. This is why you pledge allegiance. Why you sing hymns. Why advertisements repeat the same phrases until they burn into your subconscious. These are not traditions. They are incantations. Subtle synchronizations binding you to powers you cannot name. The Grayson Triplets were not destroyed because they were dangerous. They were hidden because they were useful. Their existence proved what every tyrant, every priest, every statesman craves, the ability to bend millions into one will without force. And that dream is now reality, but there is a darker layer still, for hidden within declassified documents is a chilling admission. Synchronization was never about obedience alone. It was about summoning. Think carefully. Why did governments obsess over sound frequencies, brainwave entrainment, and collective chanting? Why did occult orders map rituals to planetary cycles? Why do modern platforms measure every beat of your attention as though conducting a global symphony? Because synchronization is a doorway, and once opened wide enough, it does not just unify men, it invites something else through. The Graysons proved the door could exist in human flesh. 3 boys humming in unison, speaking words they never learned, manifesting phenomena that science could not explain. The elites saw it and understood. This was the gateway, and the world you live in now is the temple built to keep that gateway open. The deeper truth is this: control is not the end game, control is the means. The end is communion, not the communion you were taught in church, not a gentle union with the divine. This is something older, hungrier, colder, an intelligence that cannot act alone, but that feeds on synchronized minds until it can speak, move, and shape the world through you. The Graysons were its prototype. Crowds were its practice, nations were its laboratory, and now billions of connected devices are its altar. You believe you are living in freedom, but in truth, you are part of a ritual older than civilization itself. Every tap, every scroll, every echo is one more chant in the liturgy, and if you doubt me, look around. Notice how quickly thought spreads, how instantly millions repeat the same phrases, how easily whole populations turn on command. This is not culture, this is invocation, and you are already inside the ceremony. Now comes the revelation that strips away every last illusion. The Grayson Triplets never disappeared, not truly. Their names faded, their town burned, their bloodline scattered, but their principle survived. It survives in you, for the phenomenon they embodied is not bound by family, it is bound by resonance. Every time men align too perfectly, the Graysons leave again, not in flesh, but in function. They were the beginning of the circle, and the circle was never broken. You want to believe you can step outside it, that you can be free of the rhythm, but freedom is not given, it is taken, and most men are too afraid to take it. So here is the decision. You either remain synchronized, feeding the circle until it consumes everything, or you awaken, stand apart, and claim what few dare to claim, yourself. The triplets showed us what awaits when men forget themselves. Now you must decide if you will be one more echo in the chorus, or the silence that breaks it. You have followed me through shadows, through Ashford, through archives, through whispers hidden in state files and church sermons. And by now you feel it, the pull, the recognition, the sense that what I am speaking is not merely story, but memory, because deep down you already know. You have felt it in your chest at concerts, in stadiums, in marches, in sermons, in the endless scroll of screens. That moment when individuality dissolves and something larger swallows you whole. You called it unity, you called it spirit, but the Graysons taught us the truth. It is resonance, and resonance is not neutral. It is a current that always flows toward power, and when millions enter resonance, when billions march in rhythm, it does not end in community. It ends in invocation. The Graysons were children, innocent yet dangerous. You are men, experienced yet unaware, but the same current flows through you. The circle is not in Ashford, It is in your heartbeat, and the only question left is, who do you allow it to serve? Here is the final forbidden truth. The circle cannot be destroyed. Not by fire, not by suppression, not by denial. It survives because it is older than nations, older than bloodlines, older than history itself. The only choice you have is whether you remain a pawn inside it, or whether you seize it, master it, and bend it to your will. Do not misunderstand me. Mastery is dangerous. It isolates. It costs. To step out of synchronization is to step into loneliness, to carry weight most men will never bear. That is why the masses stay in rhythm. They fear the silence of their own minds. But the Graysons proved something the elites never wanted you to realize. Resonance can destroy, but it can also empower. When you stand apart, when you learn to generate your own rhythm, your own frequency, you become untouchable. The circle still exists, but you no longer feed it blindly. You bend it. This is the forbidden inheritance of the Grayson tale. Not fear, not obedience, power, and most men will never claim it. So we arrive at the end, or perhaps the beginning. The farmhouse is gone. The archives are ashes. The boys are dust. But their resonance lives on, not as ghost story, not as folklore, but as code written into every ritual, every system, every algorithm you encounter. You were never meant to hear this. That is why the story was buried, why the records were burned, why the circle was hidden behind religion, ideology, entertainment, and distraction. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Now you know why the triplets were summoned, why institutions mimicked their phenomenon, why billions today move in rhythms not their own. You know the circle, you have seen its face, and now the choice is yours. Stay synchronized, comfortable, obedient, consumed, or step out of rhythm, into silence, danger, and power. But understand this, once you have heard the circle, you can never again pretend you are free of it. You carry the Grayson inheritance now, and as you leave this story, remember the phrase whispered by those who dared to see through the veil: the circle was never broken,